Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening we're joined by Bruce Thornton. He's an author, a research fellow at the Hoover Institute. Bruce, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, what would cause someone to be interested in doing research at a level of actually making a career of it, and for the Hoover Institute in particular?
Well, when you really enjoy learning, what I discovered is the best way to learn is to write about something. And in the process of writing a book is where I've learned most of the interesting things that I've learned. And you can also pick up a few bucks doing it, so, you know, that doesn't hurt.
If they sell, that's always a good thing, right?
Well, even if they don't, there's still ways that, you know, it helps you as a career, as a writer. It helps you to publish books.
Mm-hmm. And speaking and other things.
Speaking articles, you know, such things as that, yeah.
So I know this evening you're going to be speaking at the Conservative Forum about if you like your Constitution, you can keep it. But you and I were talking a little bit before the show. You've written a number of books, 9 of them if I'm not mistaken? 10, okay. So give us a clue as to some of the titles or topics that you've covered.
Well, I started a book on ancient Greek sexuality based on the original sources in Greek. Wrote a book about the great, I've loved this story, Joaquin Murrieta, the Gold Rush era bandit, who's a huge, huge hero among Mexican people, but wasn't that well known outside. I did a book on Europe, Decline and Fall of Europe's Slow Motion Suicide, which a lot of what I and many others were talking about at the time we are seeing happening right now. And then the book previous to this, The Wages of Appeasement, looking at the ancient Greeks, looking at England in the 30s, and then looking at how we have handled the threat of Islamic Jihad, which I'll give you a spoiler. We're appeasing it, and that's a lot of our problems. So, great variety.
So it does sound like there is a variety of books that you're covering, but I am curious about how you're defining appeasement and where you see the dangers and the way that we're pursuing things now. You also talked about the suicide of Europe. Is that related?
Right. Absolutely, absolutely. There's a lot of reasons why one society, let's say, will not confront militarily another society. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about when there's a great imbalance in power. You don't have a choice if you're threatened by a much larger enemy. When Germany invaded Belgium a couple of times, Belgium is not going to defeat the Wehrmacht. So that's not appeasement. But the examples that are interesting are when a society has the power to defeat the enemy, but it won't fight. And there are a lot of reasons for that. There could be they don't want to spend the money on defense. They'd rather spend it on, as England was doing in the 20s and 30s, on social welfare. It could be fear. The impact of World War I on the imagination of Europe in the 20s and 30s can't be overestimated. It really created a never again mentality. The Germans
until next time.
Yeah, until it was again.
Yeah.
And the Germans they started exploiting that. The ink wasn't dry on the Versailles Treaty when they started violating it, and they were met with appeasement every step of the way until it culminated in World War II. And today is very interesting. I think it's just, one, we don't understand Islam, and we don't understand its history, and we don't understand its character as a religion. We don't understand what is visible on every page of 14 centuries of history, that violence is integral to Islam. We don't want to believe that. And since we don't want to confront that, and we don't want to name the enemy properly, we won't take the right steps we should take to engage it. And that means generally overwhelming force, overwhelming destructive force. But there's other reasons. We don't want to get involved. We got involved after 9/11, and we quickly got tired of it, and we didn't want to deal with it. We don't want to see the bodies coming home. We don't want people saying how mean we are. So there can be all kinds of reasons. There can be reasons of self-interest. For example, during the 20s and 30s, Germany had been the largest industrial power in Europe. And foreign investment from the United States and England was eager to get Germany back into the family of nations, its economy going again as a place for foreign investment. So that was short-sighted. Well, we're going to get economic value out of this. They didn't realize that the investment in factories that were making tractors were very quickly transformed into factories making Mark IV Panzer tanks. So sometimes people don't do a good job of looking down the road of what the consequences of their policies might be.
Right.
And this was something, let me just say, this is very interesting. De Tocqueville's famous Democracy in America, he said this about democracies. He said, democracies aren't good at long-range foreign policy planning. You have short election cycles, with us it's 2 years. Mm-hmm. You have people thinking, what disturbs me now is more important than what's much more serious going to disturb me later. So right. We have the bad habit of kicking the can down the road. Right. And I think we've been doing that. We were doing that all through the 90s when bin Laden was attacking us and telling us he had declared war on us. And we woke up a little bit after 9/11, but then quickly just settled back into the, what's Kim Kardashian up to? Right?
Well, and you make an interesting point. We are a part of a society that is kind of a microwave generation, it's been called, or that kind of thing, where people are very worried about what's happening now. They're not thinking about long-term ramifications of their decisions. But it brings us back to the topic that you're going to be covering mm-hmm. tonight, and that is, if you like your Constitution, you mm-hmm. can keep it, which you argue is a progressive myth or lie. But the founders, they had this long-term view of what they wanted the country to look like, and therefore they put the Constitution in place. But the progressive argument is that it's outdated, right. It's outlived, it needs to be able to breathe and change and right. things at will for these shorter-term kinds of scenarios. And some people would argue that the only thing we need the Constitution for is to protect people like Islamists who have different belief systems. So, yeah. I mean, tell us a little bit about the premise of your speech this evening.
Well, as we talked about earlier, it depends on how you see human nature, and it's changed through time. The consensus view going back to the ancient Greeks and Christianity all the way up until starting about the late 18th, early 19th century is that humans are tragic because they have passions and interests that drive their behavior and that are destructive to themselves and others. And they would say, look at the historical record, right, to see the levels of violence, of expropriation of other people's lands, et cetera. The progressive movement began around the 1870s, 1880s, and that's where you begin to see the idea that, well, if all of the advances in science, of physics and mechanics, et cetera, that have given us, telegraphs and steamships and telephones and commodified electricity, and look at the improvement that's made in human life, unbelievable compared to even 50 years earlier. We can do that with human nature.
Just rebuild them, restructure them, retrain them.
Well, we have sciences now, like sociology, psychology, economics. We have sciences that experts can tell us this is what you should do to make people what you want. In other words, they see people as plastic, shapeable for some ends. But if you take that point of view, as Woodrow Wilson did, one of our progressive presidents, then you know that the Constitution is unsuitable. And Wilson said the Constitution is a very 18th century. It's Newtonian. It's a balance of forces, balance of powers. Darwin has taught us that this is more of an organic, a government is organic. It grows and changes through time, and we have the ability to shape that growth and to direct those changes to achieve a certain end. And that was all based on a false assumption, which is that you can know human beings and human behavior the same way you can know how electricity works. And that's simply not true. So they began to change the Constitution in order to reflect that. And one thing they had to do was start to centralize power, whereas the founders wanted to disperse power, balance it, check it, right? Separate the legislative, executive, judiciary, balance the federal government against the sovereign state governments, which is one of the important checks.
Take that right out of there. Just, you know,
so you just start
together.
You just start encroaching upon all of these other centers of authority, and then that extends also into what we call civil society, the non-government associations and organizations and relationships we have. And you can look back from the previous 50, 60 years and see how much now federal agencies have encroached on families, on churches, etc., because they don't want a mediating authority. They'd rather deal with the people in the mass than have these other authorities, institutions, and this includes business, this includes corporations. So one way or the other, you have to try to co-opt them or regulate them or control them.
Or minimize their impact at a minimum.
Minimize their impact, exactly. Education, you know, that's obviously a big one. So they create this Leviathan state, 2.6 million federal workers, right? All these agencies, too many to count, bureaus that have all three government powers. Any agency, it makes the law. If anybody thinks Congress makes the law, Congress does not make the laws. The faceless, anonymous, unaccountable bureaucrats make the specific laws.
Or lobbyists.
They, oh, absolutely lobbyists. Absolutely lobbyists
right.
do. So they write the law, they enforce the law, and they judge when the law has been broken or not adhered to. Right. They have all three functions in one.
Right.
And that's the definition of tyranny.
Right.
Because we didn't vote for any of these people.
Right.
Right? Now, we can vote for somebody who's going to fire. We have Donald Trump who's going to get rid of a lot of the political appointees, but below that is a whole huge cadre of people who are doing the actual work. And it metastasizes through time and encroaches more and more into every dimension of our lives.
And so the theory is that the Constitution is supposed to protect us from tyranny and those kinds of scenarios that you're beginning to outline. So how do you feel that the Constitution is under attack in the first place, and why does it matter?
Well, it's under attack because it's changed over time. And it's changed because you've had a hypertrophied executive now with its executive agencies that are doing the work that Congress is supposed to do. But also it attacks the one major goal that the founders had for writing the Constitution, to protect freedom. To protect the freedom of individuals, to protect the freedom of the states, right, against any concentrated power.
And so some people would argue that it's okay if we have to give up a little freedom, like, for example, at the airport, where I always get the random gunpowder check and the extra rub down from the security guards and those kinds of things. And I understand at a certain level that we need to be safe. And at the same time, I almost wish they would take it further with the profiling. Not the rub down. I mean, I'm okay with them not going further with the rub down. You know, people argue, well, maybe we don't need as much freedom as we used to have. Or they argue, if it's for a good purpose, why not give government more control? What's the problem you see with that?
Because power, as the founders like to say, is of an encroaching nature. Any entity, whether it's an individual or whether it's an agency or whether it's the federal government or whoever it is, they're not satisfied with a little power. They want to extend it further and further. And you know, losing your freedom all at once because your city's conquered and you are enslaved as in antiquity, right? There's other ways to lose your freedom. You can lose it in a very long, drawn, insidious process, one little bit at a time. You surrender one little bit of it at a time, and it's the proverbial frog in
the boiling water.
Right. You, 1 degree at a time. Then you wake up someday, and the only freedom you have is the freedom to consume, right? To enjoy movies, to buy stuff. And that's not what the founders had in mind when they're talking about political freedom. Political freedom is being autonomous, being in control of your life, being virtuous, having the opportunity to be virtuous, and take responsibility for your actions.
Wait a minute, you just said responsibility for your actions. That's not fair. I mean, if you're not supposed to actually have consequences, are you? Is that what you're advocating?
No, that's what we like now. We don't want to pay. We want the freedom, but then when we make a choice that ends up being destructive, we don't want to take accountability for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, part of the progressive way, if you will, seems that it is about limiting the power of others to infringe upon you, but at the same time, it means that you're going to be infringing on someone else to remove their power to infringe upon you. So it's...
Yeah, well, the other point, though, is that it's also politicized. It's not across the board. It's not enforced across the board. In other words, freedom of speech will be restricted, let's say, for a conservative invited to a college campus.
Right.
And the administration will do nothing about that.
Right.
Imagine that if a conservative student group, which would never do this, tried to do the same thing to a Black Lives Matter speaker or a minority speaker or something like that.
Yeah, advocating killing cops
The
or something.
administration would be all over that. The police would be out there. It'd be like that guy in the airplane. Right,
the United flight.
They'd be dragging them off.
Right.
So that represents political power that is not used according to a uniform principle, but to satisfy a particular constituency.
Right.
And that is the essence of tyranny.
Right. But only if you're on the wrong side of it.
If you're on the wrong side, yeah, exactly.
Well, and that's where we get back to the Constitution, and it's supposed to protect everyone, right? I mean, the First Amendment's not to protect people we agree with.
No.
It's to stop us from kicking the crap out of people we don't agree with, right?
Exactly. Exactly. They understood what first arises in ancient Athens. The idea of free speech is actually created in ancient Athens, and there's 2 words in Greek for free speech. Because they understood that if you're going to empower ordinary citizens politically, they have to be able to speak publicly without the fear of any consequences. And that actually happened to an amazing extent, much more than even with us. So without that, or if that becomes selectively applied, then you're not getting the whole purpose of political discourse, which is for all those ideas to jostle around each other, to challenge each other, to rub up against each other, right? And hopefully out of that sifting process, you get a good idea. And when you short circuit that, then it's not necessarily a good idea that's going to win that battle. It might be a bad idea. And right now on college campuses, a bad idea is winning. Because if you take away free speech from a college campus, you don't have a genuine college campus anymore.
Well, with the speech goes the thought, right? If you're not allowed to speak certain things, you're not able to, in some cases, process what you're thinking within your own mind, let alone influence the way that others might think.
Exactly.
Or if you start trying to do things like teach people what to think as opposed to how to think, now all of a sudden you do dumb down the population at a level, but it also gets to that point of removing the intermediary, removing that other potential alternative authority source.
Yeah, and you're indoctrinating. You're indoctrinating. You know, the English poet and essayist Matthew Arnold had the great description, the free play of the mind on all subjects. That was liberal education's central goal. Right? That's what leads to people who can think critically because they've entertained alternatives and they've thought through them and they've had to develop arguments to meet speech that challenges what they believe. But if you take that all away, then people just repeat, you know, in an echo chamber to the choir, and then you close out all those possible alternatives. And then sometimes what is left, as happened in Germany in the 30s when they started burning the books and, you know, kicking out the Jewish professors and then all that, then you get one narrow point of view, which often can be a very destructive one. Right.
Yeah, regurgitation, basically, not tasty from my perspective. I mean, it's
not at the college level, no. I mean, you know, you gotta memorize the basics, but then you get up to the level of college, you should have all that under your belt, and now you say, what do I do with this data that I've been taught?
Right. So what's the solution? How do you protect it? How do you protect the Constitution? Is it worth protecting? How do you maintain these freedoms if you were king of the world in a non-powered way, because we don't want you to have excessive power? But I mean, what would you do?
Well, this is always the question: is what do you do? And I don't have a very good answer because
think critically. You can do it.
I think we are so far gone. And I'll give you a very quick example. I mean, Donald Trump has promised to do and has started to do some things that are necessary for reining in the Leviathan, right? Cutting back on the agencies, cutting back their budgets, cutting back their numbers of employees, cutting back on regulations. These things are all important. But he says, I am not going to touch Social Security, all right? But Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, but we don't know what's going to happen with Obamacare. Those are going to bankrupt the country eventually. Now, that's just mathematics. That's a combination of demographics, the baby boomer bulge, 65 million, and the way those programs work.
Right.
And I just read in the Wall Street Journal this morning, the debt interest payments are starting to go up seriously. So when you throw in the cost of servicing nearly $20 trillion of debt, by 2030, 2040, you're going to end up with discretionary spending taking every tax dollar, assuming the rate is 19, 20% historically of GDP. You're going to raise it up to 25, 30, then you're going to destroy the economy.
Right.
So you're going to be in a really tough position.
But compassion's important, even if it's expensive and there's no way to pay for it.
Even if it bankrupts you?
Yeah. Right, yeah. Well, but yeah, until we all starve together, it's just not fair that anyone.
Well, that's the old saying. You know, you want complete equality, everybody will be equal in misery.
Indeed.
Right? As they were in the Soviet Union.
Well, so you've given us a lot to think about, and I know that there are probably a Google search on Bruce Thornton would probably produce a lot of results, but also I'm assuming people can track you down by visiting hoover.org?
Sure. They have a search for fellows, and you should be able to find current bibliography, links to
your previous works and thinking.
My online columns, of which I've done variations on this theme, frequently, and on others as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, we thank you for joining us this evening, Bruce, and if you'll hold on for just a moment, we'll be back after a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum.
Some people think that a meeting of conservatives in Silicon Valley could fit in a small room. In fact, when the Conservative Forum was founded in 2003, we did meet in a small room, a coffee shop in San Jose. It doesn't get more grassroots than this. It may surprise you that there are thousands of people right here in Silicon Valley who share your principles of liberty, free markets, and limited government. Since our humble beginnings in that coffee shop, we've outgrown 3 meeting halls. From San Jose to Gilroy to Mill Valley, we bring hundreds of people together each month from all over the Bay Area to promote the principles of American liberty. How do we do it? It starts with a stellar lineup of speakers. Speakers like Steve Forbes, Senator Jim DeMint, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, Andrew Breitbart, Pamela Geller, and many others. These speakers passionately articulate our shared principles and remind us why conservatism isn't just the smart choice, it's also the moral choice. Our monthly meetings are only one dimension of the forum. We underwrite The Right Side, a monthly television show on cable access channel KMVT. We also host a monthly Constitution discussion group and provide tables at our meetings for more than a dozen local groups who share our love of liberty to promote their specific cause. The Conservative Forum is the premier place in Silicon Valley for conservatives to gather, become invigorated, motivated, and empowered. We welcome guests to our monthly meetings and offer special discounted pricing to first-time visitors. Take a look at our speaker lineup in the coming months and join us to learn why we say liberty is made in America.
And that was a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum. And we appreciate them underwriting the show over the last Now, this is the 6th season, but what they're best known for is their speaker series, and that's why we were able to have Bruce join us in the studio this evening, because he'll actually be speaking this evening at the IFES Portuguese Hall at 432 Stearland Road in Mountain View, about 3 minutes here from the studio. In May, Melanie Phillips is going to be joining us. She's a British journalist, a broadcaster, and author, and she'll be talking about Islam in Europe, a topic we covered for a moment today. And in June, Clint Bolick of the Arizona Supreme Court will be joining the forum as well. You can find out more at theconservativeforum.com for details on events, times, etc. And in closing this evening, Bruce covered a number of different topics, a little bit about freedom of speech and the impacts it has, the Constitution and it being important to protect it so that we can keep those freedoms that have become valuable to us. But if you're looking for more information on his thinking or on topics that he might have only been able to cover for just a second this evening, you can find out more at hoover.org or Google him, Bruce Thornton, and he'll show up all over the place, I'm sure. I just want to thank you for joining us this evening. I've been your host, Chris Pareja. This has been The Right Side, and we do look forward to seeing you on the show or in person sometime soon. But if you just can't wait, reach out to us at therightsidetv@gmail.com, and I'll catch those flaming darts and respond appropriately, or just answer any questions that you have. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great night.